Ladies and gentlemen, please stand by. Good day, everyone, and welcome to this Accelerating Your NSP Spending webinar. Today's webinar is being recorded. At this time, I would like to turn the webinar over to Ms. Marcia Tonkovich. Please go ahead, ma'am.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this NSP webinar in the series of webinars that HUD has been doing. And we're going to talk today a little bit more about the spending deadlines that are coming up on the NSP1, 2, and 3 programs and some tactics and techniques for how to address those spending deadlines. So before we jump in, I'd like to just do a little bit of introduction. I have two HUD colleagues here with me, Jesse and Hunter, and I'll let you guys introduce yourselves. So, Jesse?
Hi, I'm Jessie Hanforth-Combe. I'm the Deputy Director of the Office of Block Grant Assistance and erstwhile NSP team member.
I'm Hunter Kurtz. I'm a member of the NSP team and webinar guru.
And guys, Hunter is the one that you want to reach out to if you have a particular topic for a webinar that you haven't seen on the schedule that you'd like to request. He's been kind enough to schedule all of these and keep them all moving forward. So I am Marcia Tonkovich with ICF. I know I've met many of you before on previous webinars or out at the clinics or the technical assistants, and I'm glad to be with you guys today and share some of the lessons that we've learned and feedback we've heard from other colleagues, other grantees. So before we jump into the content, just a recap of how to ask a question. So in the live meeting, if you notice the top right-hand corner of your screen, you'll see that you have a green button right now. If you want to ask a question, and we'll get to the question segment a little bit later, please change that dot to purple, and that'll let us know that you want to ask a question. It won't actually get you in the question queue. Then, if you could do us a favor and press *1 on your phone, that will put you literally in the phone queue, and then we'll take the questions in the order they are received. If somebody else in the queue has already asked your question, and so you no longer need to ask it, press *1, and that will, or excuse me, *2, and that will take you out of that queue. If you don't want to ask your question audio and you want to write it in, you can also go up to the top left-hand corner of your live meeting, and you'll see where it says Q&A, and it will allow you to type in a question, and we'll go through those typed-in questions as well. So we'll alternate between the written-in questions and the audio questions. We do ask that if you have a complicated question, where there's a case you want to lay out or a difficult policy question you want to ask, please do, but we ask that you do it in the audio because we can't really follow up. It's hard to do back and forth on the written-in to get the context of what you're asking us about. So you can use either methodology that you would like. So what are we going to cover today? We're going to start with just a quick recap of what are those spending rules and where do we currently stand in terms of the 3 programs and getting money expended and what are the key deadlines. We're then going to talk a little bit about what are some of the common areas where people are seeing expenditure slowdowns, what are the sort of groupings of places where or issues that are causing slow spending. And then what are some of the solutions? And there's a variety of tactics and a variety of suggestions that we got from other grantees, TA providers, HUD, and so we'll go through that menu of possible solutions sorted by each of those topic areas or issue areas. We then have a couple of short case studies that are typical kinds of projects and typical kinds of issues that we heard from folks, and we'll walk through some ways to do it. We'll take your questions. We're going to probably take them at the end after we've gotten through the slides and gotten through the case studies. But if that starts to go too long and people want to queue up for questions, we can stop and take a break in the middle. And then finally, we are going to ask for some feedback throughout. We've been using, I think for those of you who are on the calls earlier in January, we've been using some polling kinds of functions, and that lets us all see kind of what you guys are thinking and give feedback even though everybody is muted on the phone. So we'll be doing that at periodic junctures throughout. So we're going to start with our first feedback. So Vinny, can you move us on to the first feedback? So we'd like you guys to choose which of these you'd like to see most from this webinar. More tools and tips, guidance on how HUD's going to look at expenditure deadlines. I'd like to hear more peer-to-peer. You want time to ask technical questions, or it's none of those things. We'll give it a moment. Please feel free to vote if you're on the line. All right, so it looks like we're getting sort of a good distribution, but the commonality here is we want information on how HUD is going to look at the expenditure deadlines and then also some tools and tips. So luckily, that is the sort of predominance of the slides we're going to cover, but we do have some time for peer-to-peer as well. So thanks very much, and we'll go on to the next poll, Vinny. Okay, so how are you doing on your expenditures? And this is anonymous, guys. We don't know who's voting for what, so don't feel any pressure. So the first one is, we've analyzed it, and we're totally cool on all 3 deadlines, whether NSP1, 2, or 3. We're doing good on NSP1, but we're worried about 2 or 3, or we're worried about all of them for all of our expenditures, or we don't know yet. We need to do some analysis based upon what we're learning. Okay, so it looks like lots of folks are feeling good about NSP1, but are worried about 2 or 3 is sort of our most common, although we have some folks who are worried about all of them and some folks who aren't quite sure yet. So that's great, and we will focus on all 3 programs, but we'll try to hit on some of those issues that are specific to 2 and 3, particularly around some of the program income questions. All right, great. So Vinny, please take us back to the PowerPoint. Okay, great. So let's talk about those HUD rules, and we'll get in quickly then to a discussion of what it means in terms of when we get to the end of these deadlines. So first, and this is across all 3 programs, the clock that HUD's going to measure when we talk about the time frames for the expenditures starts with the date that HUD signed your grant agreement. So for some programs, for NSP2, that's the same date for everybody. For some programs, NSP1 and NSP3, that date is going to vary depending on when you and HUD executed your grant agreement. So if you don't know the date that HUD signed your grant agreement for 1 or 3, for NSP1 or 3, go back and pull that agreement, or if you don't have a copy, talk to your HUD field office, and they can tell you your specific date. We're going to give you the general dates, but obviously it will vary depending on your signature date. So for NSP1, the requirement way back when, and I know it seems like an awful long time ago given how hard people have been working, but the rule was that you had to spend 100% within 4 years of signing that grant agreement, of HUD signing that grant agreement. And most of us signed the grant agreement somewhere between February and March. So somewhere, I think most folks are in March, but there's a couple at the end of February. And so your 4-year deadline will come due 2013 or next year about this time, or a month or so from now next year. So we're getting toward the end of the 4-year period, but we're doing really well. And if anybody wants more information about this data, you can certainly look on the NSP website, or you can talk to your HUD field office. They can give you all of your specific grantee data if you don't have it. But nationwide, we're doing great. We have 86.1% has been drawn down in DRGR, and we'll talk about drawn down versus expended in a moment, which means that we have 102 of the NSP1 grantees who are at least at 100% drawn, and we have a 1 grantee, which is Fresno County, California. Congratulations to you guys, who are at 200%. And what that means is that they've had a lot of program income, and therefore when they've reported their draws and their activities, they've actually been higher than their original grant allocation. So there are a number of grantees who are in that same position, and that's terrific. We do have 12 grantees who are still at less than 50% on NSP1, but again, it may be that they have specific large projects that are coming, or they have things in the pipeline that just haven't yet moved through. So we're doing pretty well on NSP1, and that's reflected in what you guys said in the poll we just did about how you're feeling about NSP1 as well. Jesse and Hunter, anything to add on NSP1 before we go on to 2?
No, just that, what we'll talk about as we go on, since there was some interest on, how we would evaluate and handle it, we will get to that. And we're doing great overall in NSP1, but we are coming back and looking at the slow spenders again and thinking about what kind of TA we could provide. So if grantees know that they're struggling a little on NSP1, they should be talking to the field offices and talking to their NSP specialists so that we can figure out how to lift you so you'll make it by your deadline.
Great. And we will come back and talk about what it means not to make it in a few minutes. Okay, so NSP2. So as I mentioned, that deadline was in February. We had an interim deadline according to that statute, which was that 50% of the money had to have been expended within 2 years, and that date just passed, 2 weeks ago or so, and we really did well. Virtually everybody made the deadline. We're not a lot over the deadline, but did really well, and people have worked very, very hard to get that money spent. And so I think, and Jesse, I'll let you jump in here, I think HUD is very pleased with the progress so far.
Yes, everybody in the pool lost their money. I mean, there was no pool, of course. We were not betting on it, but yes, we did better than we expected. We were delighted.
So that's terrific, and I know everybody is just really, there was a big push for many grantees. If you watch the numbers, and I do every week, you could see where we were a couple of months ago and how hard people were working to get things moving these last couple of months. So
what's interesting is they're still moving.
Yes.
There's a number of large draws in process. I'm CC'd whenever the system has an extremely large draw, so I see them. So we're still moving, and I can tell that there's a lot of people updating their information during the 30-day review period, which I strongly encourage everyone to take a look at and make sure you got it right.
Yeah, so do make sure that what you reported is accurate, and we'll come back and talk about expended versus drawn in just a moment. So that's great, and I think everybody who is an NSP2 grantee should feel very proud of having certainly reached that goal. However, there's, of course, another deadline looming over our heads, which is that we have the next year, by February 11th, 2013, to have spent the balance of the grant, so 100% by then. We're currently at 54% expended or 56% drawn. And let me give you a distinction between those two, and then we'll talk about what that means in a minute. So when we say expended, that means what the grantees have reported in their QPRs as having been expended. So the QPR that you file on a quarterly basis with HUD, letting them know what you've spent your money on, is 54%. If you were to go in the DRGR and look at the drawn, in other words, how much money have you actually drawn down out of DRGR, it's actually at 56%. So exactly what accounts for that difference can't totally nail it down, but I would suggest that it's probably due to people who have drawn down money and not yet gotten it into their QPR. And so their QPR is out of date or not fully complete or whatever it might be.
There's also some revolving funds, Marcia.
Yes, and that would help as well, because you would have money coming back into a revolving fund. You wouldn't, again, not a lump sum drawdown necessarily, but the money coming back into it, and that would account as well for things that are drawn, but you haven't yet pulled it out of the RLF. So there's a little bit of a difference there, but generally speaking, we're in the mid-50s in terms of where we are nationwide. Now, what does that mean? So we have about $875 million left to go under NSP2 that we have the 12 months you'll have to spend it. The scary part about this is, so we spent about $45 million on average per month in the last 24 months. In the next 12 months, in order to get to that $875 million, we have to be spending about $70 million per month. So it's a fairly large uptick, not quite a doubling, but almost a doubling of the expenditures per month. So that's a pretty big increase in volume to get to the end. Now, that said, many folks, it takes a while to set up the program. There were environmental reviews to be done, partners to be chosen, and so there was sort of a ramp-up time period that happened in the first 6 months of the program, or maybe even longer. And so we're now in the swing of it, and the expenditure rate is going up. And so it may well be that this $70 million per month target on a nationwide basis is not a challenge because we're at this ramp-up period. But it's important to make it, to recognize that it is an uptick from the previous average. So that's where we stand on NSP2. On NSP3, so same rules we had for NSP2, 50% within 2 years. So that 50% deadline is next year at about this time. And again, it depends on the date that you had HUD signed your grant agreement. So anywhere between March and April of next year. And then 100% within 3 years, so that'll be 2014, March to April, again, depending on your grant date. Now here, we're not doing quite as well. We're down at about 7.5% of draws out of DRGR for NSP3. Now, I think if we look at this logically, it's probably because people were spending their NSP1 money first and NSP2 money as well, because that had the 50% deadline, and that makes sense. And we also have a number of new grantees who are only NSP3 recipients who never had one or two, and so they had to set up those systems and do those environmental reviews and all those upfront things that everybody else did a year or two ago. So there's some logic in why we're at 7.5%, but it means there's a good way to go before we get a year from now to the 50% deadline, and then 2 years from now for the 100% deadline. We do have a handful of grantees under NSP3 who are already above 50% drawn, which is terrific. And then we have a lot of grantees who are really, you're in good company if you're down below the 10%, and a number of grantees who are at 0. So the key thing on those folks who are at 0, you really want to make sure you begin to get the data into the system, because as we get closer to the 50% deadline, you're going to start getting outreach from your HUD office, from HUD headquarters, to really try to start showing that. And so if you're a new grantee particularly, and it's a matter of getting those systems set up and starting and learning the program if you are new, we encourage you to reach out to your field office, to reach out to the NSP website to ask for help, to help with the program design, help with the policies and procedures, the environmental review, whatever it is, to get your process moving and start getting that money moving. Because as we get closer, there will obviously be a lot more pressure and a lot more scrutiny as we get closer to the 50% deadline. So it's important to do that. Now, before we move on, we did get a question, and we've been getting questions on the Ask a Question desk about grantees who have NSP1, 2, and 3 money and who are earning program income under NSP1 and yet have NSP3 money to spend. And so the question is, if I'm earning program income on NSP1, and we know that program income has a first-in, first-out rule, do I have to spend that program income on NSP1 before I can draw NSP3, money out of the DRGR? And the answer is no. They're tracked separately. So you're going to track your NSP1 program income, and you do have to spend that NSP1 program income before you can draw down more NSP1 funds. But that doesn't affect your activities under NSP3. You can continue to spend your NSP3 money, and you can continue to do whatever activities are in that approved plan, regardless of the program income you have from NSP1. So you're required to track them separately, to do the first in, first out, but it's program by program. So, Jesse, anything to add on that one?
I don't, except I don't use the term first in, first out for program income, so I'm kind of adjusting here. But the 3 grants, NSP1, NSP2, NSP3, run separately. They're not like CDBG or home, where you get an annual appropriation to a CDBG or home program. Because Congress changed the rules every time between the rounds of NSP, you can't count on NSP1 funds being under exactly the same rules of NSP3. They're close but not exactly the same, which means that program income to NSP1 does not affect the NSP3 draws. That's the logic behind it. A lot of people have asked me, and that's basically what happened.
Great. So, guys, I think that's really important for those of you who have multiple sources, and it's good that you're getting program income. We certainly do not want program income to be a deterrent to making these deadlines. So let's dig into what does all this mean, and how is HUD going to look at it, and how does it affect what you're reporting and what you're counting. So I think we have to start with, what does it mean to expend the funds? And about a month ago, we did a webinar that was as we were coming close to the NSP2 50% deadline, and the financial leader at HUD, Paul Webster, I think gave us a very good policy clarification that I think went out to everybody that's very important, which is that drawn down from DRGR, in other words, having pulled the money out of DRGR, is not the same thing as expended, and that in fact expended can have a broader definition than just I've drawn it down out of DRGR. So if you are on the accrual method of accounting, which virtually all grantees are, but some of you may not be, if you're on the accrual method, then once you've encumbered, and by that we mean legally encumbered, an expense, then you can count that expense, that as an expenditure. You can count that cost as an expenditure. So for example, let's say that you're doing construction, and you have a construction contractor who's under contract to you, and he or she has finished a particular part of the rehabilitation. And it doesn't have to be the whole rehab. Perhaps he's finished the roof. And he sends you an invoice for doing that roof, and so you've received that bill, but given your internal processing and approvals and, whatever else has to happen before you can draw out of DRGR and make a payment to that contractor, nonetheless, you've got that bill in hand. That bill that you have received, that invoice, if you're on an accrual method of accounting, counts as expended. So you get credit for having done that activity, received that invoice, even though you haven't yet drawn down that money out of DRGR.
And Marcia, the reason for that, for a non-financial person, is that those funds are considered outlaid, that they don't belong to you anymore. The work was done, and so you're beyond just legally under a contract to pay it. They're literally not your money anymore. And everybody knows that you may question some of the costs in the voucher and everything like that, but up until the point that you actually do question them, the funds are actually not considered yours, even though they're still in your bank account. They're considered the contractors.
Right. Right. So this is a way to address the fact that many grantees do have approval processes and their own tracking systems and whatever else with their finance departments that might take a little while to get through. You still get to get credit for having received that invoice. Now, one of the questions we've been getting since Paul made this policy clarification is, okay, so what counts as encumbered? In that contractor example, would it be enough to be able to say that the contractor actually did the roof, but yet he hasn't invoiced me yet? Could I count that? And generally the answer is no. In general, you do have to have some piece of paper, a bill, an invoice, maybe an inspection, although I'll let Jesse talk about that, but some way of proving that this is the cost that was incurred and that's going to be, that is being billed. So it's not enough to have a contract with a contractor saying he will, rehab the house for this price. It has to be that he did do the rehab and he's billing you for whatever portion, whatever proportional portion of that rehabilitation you can count as expended. Jesse, do you want to talk about any exceptions to that?
No, I want people to do it the straight, normal way.
All right. So base it on invoices, guys. So make sure you have an invoice to back up what you're calling encumbered, something from the contractor. And it doesn't have to be a construction contractor. If you have services that you've contracted for, like inspectors and they're billing you, if you have subrecipients and they're billing you, whatever, but you have a bill from that partner. How are you going to get credit for that then? As I mentioned earlier, you may not have drawn this yet down out of DRGR, but yet you've received this bill. So the way you're going to do it, when you file your quarterly report, your QPR, in the discussion of your expenditures to date, you can include those costs which were encumbered but not yet drawn. So that's how HUD is going to count that. So if you want credit for those encumbrances, you do have to put it in your QPR. So as I mentioned earlier, I think that distinction between the QPR and what's in DRGR accounts for some of why those numbers are different. And we'd like to see those QPRs get more accurate so that you're getting credit for those yet to be paid encumbrances. Now, because HUD has no way of knowing other than what's in the QPR, and the QPRs are, written into each one, on a nationwide basis, HUD doesn't have any way of really looking at expenditures because we don't know what's sitting on your desk. So if you look at the HUD reports, the DRGR reports that you'll see that are published by HUD and available on the NSP website will use drawn as a proxy, just sort of a rough estimate. It's not going to be totally exactly right, as I mentioned earlier. But
in our review guides for the field, we do tell them to look for big gaps between drawn and expended as a warning signal. This difference between drawn and expended is one of the reasons that I say, and I get in trouble regularly with field staff for saying this, but it's true, that no QPR is going to be perfect. We only expect the only perfect report on a grant is the last one. But we are striving to get better and better and better, and we are looking for warning signals and risk signals, and one of the risk signals is an unexplained difference between draws and expenditures on a QPR.
Okay. Yeah, so if you are not the same person who does the QPR, or if you have a finance person who does one thing, the invoices, and a different person does your reporting, it would be important, I think, to get those folks together and take a look at the QPR and also your raw data in DRGR and independently assess, as a grantee, why do these differ, or if there is a significant difference. Okay, so how much actually has to be expended? Because there is this issue of program income, right? That for all 3 programs, we could be earning program income, and the way I describe it is first in, first out, but you could use whatever terminology, but the idea is that program income has to be spent in general, and there are some exceptions, but in general, program income has to be spent prior to, for that same grant, NSP1, 2, or 3, prior to drawing down additional money from that same grant. So the concern regarding the expenditure deadline was, okay, so is program income going to harm me in terms of making the deadlines because I have to spend that program income first, and yet I have money sitting in my grant account at DRGR? And the answer is no, that the way that HUD has defined how much must be expended by the dates that we've talked about is the amount of your grant award. So, for example, if your grant award was $5 million, that's what your contract with HUD, your agreement with HUD says you're awarded $5 million on NSP1, let's say. Then $5 million, wherever it comes from, whether it comes from the grant amount, whether it comes from program income, $5 million is the amount that you would have to have expended by the deadline, in this case for NSP1. So if you had $400,000 of program income under NSP1, you would have to spend that $400,000 first before you could draw down more money out of DRGR, and obviously this probably wouldn't happen in a big lump, but would happen in chunks. But you wouldn't have to have spent $5.4 million at the end of the expenditure deadline, rather just the total of $5 million of the grant amount. So that $5 million could come $400,000 out of the program income and $4.6 million out of the grant to get to the total of $5. And so what that would mean, if you were this grantee, and that's exactly what you spent, you would have $400,000 sitting in your DRGR account when we got to the expenditure due date, when we got to the end date. And that would be totally fine. That money isn't going to go away. You don't lose it. It's still eligible for you to reuse for other eligible activities, meeting a national objective, all those good things. So having program income is a good thing because it lets your program be bigger. It doesn't harm you in terms of the deadlines. And as an aside, I would encourage folks to take a look at revolving loan funds as another way of addressing program income, and there is old webinars on that you can look at the archives and learn more about. Jesse or Hunter, anything to add on program income?
It's a good thing, and you should keep track of it. I really don't have a lot to add on program income.
Okay. So what's going to happen then when we get to the expenditure deadline, and obviously 1, 2, and 3 separately? So as I mentioned, if you do have money still sitting in your DRGR account, and if you've met thresholds, so you've expended at least equal to your original grant allocation, then that money just stays there, and you can continue to use it for eligible activities according to the rules. Now, you won't be able to close out, we don't think, and Jesse, I'll let you jump in here, your NSP grants until you've spent those funds and you've met the national objective and all of that, and there'll be more detail coming out from HUD about closeout, but that's not a problem. So you should, that should be, you should be able to continue doing eligible activities. Jesse, anything more about the closeout notice?
Well, we're working on it. There was a closeout notice issued recently for every other program, but not NSP. Not a Federal Register notice, but a standard CPD notice. It's up on the HUD's recovery website for CDBGR, and you can see what the basics are of the closeout chassis, as it were. NSP1 and NSP3 are on appropriations that are what we call no-year money, which means that we can design our own rules, logical rules around the program in terms of the availability of the funding, and we have done that. And so this is definitely true for NSP1 and 3, that we can wait until the national objectives met and sort of stand over the grantee and keep the accounts open. It's less clear for NSP2 because it's part of the Recovery Act, and there are expectations for how fast Recovery Act funds will spend out. And so we're urging grantees, particularly NSP2 grantees, to talk to us about program designs. We'll get your funds and your line of credit expended as soon as it's feasible. What you've presented so far is correct, Marcia, but there's a little nervousness on our part about holding those NSP2 accounts open for too much past the deadline. And we'll be talking about that more in the closeout notice.
Because Congress may come back and say this had a time frame attached to it, we'd like it back.
That, or the Recovery Act has a board, the Recovery Act board, that oversees all the Recovery Act funds. And NSP2 was designed to start late in the Recovery Act anyway, so it stands out. It represents a big chunk of the remaining funds to be outlaid from the Recovery Act. So there's more and more intense scrutiny of it. So far, it looks very good, particularly at this 50% deadline, and I don't have special worries about it, but it's just sort of a heads up for NSP2 grantees.
So it might mean for those of you guys who are NSP2 grantees who are earning a lot of program income, and there are some of you who are, think about how you can expand your program, or think about that revolving loan fund that I mentioned,
right,
as a way of addressing, getting these funds into use.
Right, and of course these deadlines are going to occur into the next administration.
Correct.
Or, as I said to you before the call, Marcia, we know who the sheriff is now. We don't know necessarily who the sheriff's going to be at the deadline.
Yeah, so that for those of you guys who are seeing a lot of program income coming in, you want to be thinking about that. All right, now what if you don't meet the deadline? So that was if you do. What if you don't? And that gets verified. So it's not just that there's a paperwork issue or something like that, but assume that you really didn't meet it. HUD's current policy approach is that they will recapture those unspent funds. And the way our understanding of the statute is that NSP money, if it is in fact recaptured for NSP2, goes straight back to Treasury because of the way the statute was written once it in fact is recaptured. For NSP1 and 3, it could, and again, HUD hasn't yet gotten there, so we don't know this is what would happen, but it could go back out to other grantees in a reallocation. So right now, HUD's policy is that if you don't meet the expenditure deadlines, that they will likely do recapture. And, unlike the obligation deadline and the recent NSP2 expenditure deadline where there was a 30-day grace period and HUD is working it out with grantees and so forth, we are not sure that kind of a grace period or that kind of a flexibility will be available on any of the expenditure deadlines, 1, 2, or 3, because Congress did place, as Jesse said earlier, this sort of emphasis on getting the money spent quickly. So right now the HUD policy is there will be recapture if you get to the end of the deadline, whether it's 1, 2, or 3, and you have not expended your grant amount. And how HUD will do that is basically that you'll be found in noncompliance with your grant agreement, which said that you would in fact meet these expenditure deadlines. Jesse, anything to add on that?
Just that the October 19, 2010 notice explicitly says for NSP1 at the 4-year deadline that HUD will recapture and reallocate.
So I think for those guys who, there has been a little bit of flex on some of the earlier deadlines and HUD has certainly worked with grantees to address them, I think you're hearing a slightly harder line here on the expenditures, these end 100% expenditure deadlines. So keep that in mind as you're working toward them. All right, now, what if I make the 100% deadline because I had program income and whatever else, but I didn't meet the 25% set aside? So within, as you guys know, but just to recap, within the 100% expenditure requirements, there is a requirement that 25% of those monies go to assisting people who are at 50% of AMI and below, the so-called LH25 requirement, low-income 25%. What happens if you've met the overall deadline but not the 25% portion of that? And there are a number of folks who are in that boat, and you'll see there's 158 NSP1, a number of NSP2, and a large number of NSP3 grantees, but when you look at the total proportion of their expenditures, are at less than 25% going toward very low income or low income. So what happens in that instance? And their HUD hasn't yet fully come down on a firm policy, but it will be a firm response because HUD takes this requirement quite seriously, and Congress meant it seriously in terms of benefiting low-income people with these monies. And so HUD will either make you repay the money out of your own funds, in other words, dip into your own pocket to make up what you should have done, or require you to repay the balance of what is yet owed. And it's even possible that HUD could come back to you and say, you were so remiss in having met this, this requirement, you weren't even close, that we are going to take all of your money back. So it's a very serious requirement, and for those of you guys who are underneath the 25% or not close to it, take a look at your program design and do what you have to do now to redesign to make sure that you meet the 25% set aside. Again, Jesse or Hunter, anything to add on that?
Yes. A violation of this, according to our litigation attorneys, is also a violation of the Federal False Claims Act, which means you could actually be liable for 3 times your grant amount.
That's obviously significant. And I think, again, it comes back to Congress was trying to tell us something about public policy when they put in this requirement. It's an important part of what HUD has to tell Congress about how this money was spent. And so HUD obviously takes it seriously as well. So if you're in that boat where you're not proportionally drawing and where you're showing you're behind, it may be that you have a big rental project that's yet to come, and you will, in fact, catch up. But make sure there's a plan for getting there. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what we did. Some discussions with, as I said, with HUD, with other providers, with grantees, and sort of boiled down what are some of the root causes of slow spending, and then we're going to talk about some of the solutions. So the first sort of grouping of causes are around financing. So either we are doing a home buyer approach, and those home buyers are having a hard time finding private capital, private mortgages, or it's a developer approach, perhaps it's a nonprofit developer, and they can't get construction financing, or we are leveraging NSP with other resources, particularly tax credits has been an issue here, but it could be state money or other kinds of money, and that other money isn't yet committed or isn't yet lined up. And so the speed of getting that leveraged money, that other financing money, it is slowing down our ability to spend NSP. And so we'll come back and talk about how we can tweak that in a moment. But that, I think everybody can see kind of how those sorts of financing issues would affect the expenditure of NSP funds. The second grouping of kinds of issues have to do with the acquisition of units and the timing of construction. And we did, I think for everybody who's on this call, you probably noticed that we sent out sort of a request for ideas and questions and suggestions before this webinar. And the most common response that we got back from folks was a difficulty in finding or acquiring units that are in your currently identified target area that are abandoned, foreclosed, or vacant. And so finding those units, negotiating for those units, getting in there before investors, all those sorts of things continue to be an ongoing problem because obviously we're constrained in the kind of units that we can look at. There are some places where we've had some construction delays, whether it's weather-related or whether it's the issue with the experience or the volume of contractors we have available. There are some places where they're using new contractors or smaller contractors, and those contractors don't have the capacity or the developers don't have the capacity to take on a lot of projects all at once. And so even though there's units and even though there's demand from home buyers, there's not enough rapidity in how quickly the contractors can turn around the units. So things around the acquisition and construction of the units. The third major bucket has to do internal to the grantee or the subrecipients, where we or our partners don't have administrative capacity. We don't have enough staff to process these applications quick enough or to pay the bills quick enough or to find the projects quick enough, perhaps because we weren't able to hire. I know a number of grantees were under hiring freezes in the last couple of years, or we weren't able to contract out for support. In many grantees, it's not the staffing issue. It has to do with the systems. that our financial systems are slow to process payments and track payments, or our ability to track and report on projects isn't as good as it could be. So there's internal sort of systematic issues. And then for a number of grantees, the environmental reviews, particularly for the larger projects and multifamily projects, have been a source of slowness for some grantees. And we'll talk a little bit later about some solutions that folks have come up with. So there have been some issues about having to wait for those, or for the SHPO, the historic review. And finally, the fourth sort of category of causes has to do with the back-end demand for units. That in a number of jurisdictions, there are too many units on the market, and it's hard to find either a sufficient number of buyers, or in some places it's not the number of buyers, it's buyers who are qualified to become homeowners, who can get the private mortgage, or who have the credit history, or whatever it might be, or frankly the simple demand, that there just aren't people out there who are looking to buy right now. There's been a lot of press lately about people shifting their expectations from being homeowners to being renters. And so in some communities, that demand has shifted from ownership to rental. In addition, in some places, in some communities, we've seen the market change. And so the original target areas that you identified are now either tapped out, they're already fully developed, or they've settled down, or whatever's happened, and the area has moved to a different part of town where the foreclosures are occurring, or the abandoned units are occurring. And so there's a shift, and there's no longer need in that old target area, but there is in some new target area. And then finally, as I mentioned, we have seen some changing from home buyer to rental, rental to buyer, depending on the changing market in the local community. So let's do the next poll, Vinny, about what's been your greatest expenditure issues. So is it the funding issues? Is it finding and rehabbing those units? Is it our own internal systems? Is it my partner's systems, subrecipient developer systems? Or is it we're having movement in our demand for our units? So far and away, it looks like our most common issue here has to do with difficulty in acquiring and constructing units, although some related to our partners as well. So that's very consistent with what we heard prior to the webinar, and we'll talk about some tips and techniques around all of these areas, but we'll specifically focus on acquiring and constructing units and those systems and capacity. Okay, great. Vinny, let's go back to the PowerPoint. All right, so before we jump into sort of what to do, let's talk about how you assess the status. So I think the first thing you want to ask yourself, whether you're a subrecipient or whether you're a consortium member or a grantee, is what is our expenditure rate? Get that data. It's available on the NSP website. If you can't get to it, or if you want more detail, because they actually have more detail, talk to your HUD field office. They can get you more information. And you can also find it in DRGR as well. Look at how your expenditure rates vary by activity type. You might find out that your home buyer program is moving much more quickly than your rental program, or vice versa. Or you might find out that your demolition program is what is slow. If you can break it down into its component parts, then you can try to figure out what's causing this delay. Is it the market? Is it our partners? Is it the systems? Whatever it might be. But looking at your expenditures for all of NSP1 is harder to analyze than saying, let's break it down by the types of programs that I established when I did my action plan. Then you can say to yourself, okay, so if I know what programs are moving faster, and I know what's happening in my marketplace in terms of demand changes, then do we need to change our program design? Is there something about our focus, whether it's homeownership versus rental, whether it's the neighborhood that we're in, whether it's the way we're financing the projects, and we'll come back and get into more detail on those. But now is the time. You don't want to try to be redesigning your program 2 months before the expenditure deadline comes up. But there is still time to do it now, and we'll talk about what that means for your action plan. Take a look at whether or not some of the delay is due to very specific micro issues, like a particular project or two where they're held up because of the tax credits, or they're held up because of some state approval. And you know that's going to happen in the next month or two. And when that does, it'll break free and the logjam will move, and you'll be able to get a lot of money. And there have been, we saw this in NSP2, where there were a number of places where they had some big deals that were pending, and as soon as those big deals moved, they went right over the goal. So, take a look and see if there's something like that that helps to explain it. And then finally, take a look at what are the reasons why, we're slow. Is it about my internal processes? Is it about my partners and their capacity? Or is it about the market and the demand for my units and the available units and all of that? But do that assessment first before jumping into solutions. If you find that your delay is in fact not just one or two projects that are pending, but actually is systematic and something you think is a concern, and there were a number of you for NSP2 and 3 and for all the programs where you're worried about it, then it's a time to gather more data. And so talking to your staff and your subrecipients, and if you find that the issues have to do with your own internal processes or your subrecipients' processes, one of the tools that you might want to use is called process mapping. And what that means is sit down with that partner or with your staff, if it's an internal process, and map out all the steps. Get a big whiteboard or a chalkboard or whatever, flip chart paper, and map out all the steps in your process. First we do this, and then we do that, and then we do the other, and look at how much time each of those steps are taking. And if you do that, you'll see that, perhaps it is the environmental review that's the problem, or perhaps it's how long it's taking us to get invoices in from our developers. But whatever it is, you'll have a sense of where the delay is, and then you'll be able to hone in on that and change that particular process. So, and it doesn't take very long. It's not very hard to do, probably, depending on how big your grantee is and how big your program is, not more than a couple of hours. But if you have to sit down and map out the process and think about the times associated with each, the real times, not the theoretical times, it helps to figure it out. We also do recommend talking to your neighbors. Oftentimes markets kind of are regional, and so it may be that your neighboring county or your neighboring city has the same problem you do, and they may have come up with some solutions, like a particular lender who's very helpful, or a source for finding available units, or a nonprofit developer who's particularly effective. So, try talking to your colleagues in your region, and if you don't know them, contact your field office or your association if you're a member of CASCA or NCSHA or NCDA or one of those associations, and they can help connect you with your neighbors. We also do recommend going out to your developers and contractors and asking them what slows them down. Some of what they're going to tell you, Davis-Bacon or environmental, we can't really affect. But there probably are things about the way they have to invoice and the pieces of paper they have to fill out or how they are required to find the units that perhaps you may have some control over. And then finally, get input from local lenders and realtors about what they're saying about where units are available and what they're seeing about the inventory and the financing and demand from buyers and all of that. All of that should give you some good input to then be able to put some solutions in place. But let's jump into those solutions, and then we'll do the questions. I think we'll see where we are at the end. So let's assume your issues, if you've done that analysis, your issues are around the financing. You've got, whether it's leveraging or whether it's your own money getting out there, your issues are around the financing. So a couple of things that other people have used, lessons that people have learned. First, think about NSP, the timing of when it goes into a deal, and think about using NSP to pay for 100% of the acquisition, assuming the acquisition is eligible, of course, but rather than proportionally investing in the project. So by that I mean, there are some grantees who have said, we'll only pay 20% of the acquisition cost, and then we'll pay 20% of the rehab cost, or 20% of the soft cost, or whatever it is. And while you can certainly do that, you don't have to do that. One of the misconceptions about NSP that people had early on was that HUD sort of cared about spreading the money across all the phases of development, or that it mattered which phase you invested in. It doesn't. What matters is what proportion of the total development cost, the total eligible development cost, is paid with NSP. It doesn't matter exactly what line item you paid for. So if the total development cost is $1 million and you put $200,000 entirely into acquisition and somebody else paid for rehab and construction, that's okay. You're still going to have 20% of those units be NSP assisted and meet the national objectives and all those good things. It doesn't matter that your money only went into the acquisition line item as long as that acquisition was eligible. Now, obviously, you're not going to pay for ineligible acquisition costs, but think about the line item you're investing in and think about the things which happen early, which leads us to the next suggestion, which is front-loading the NSP investment. One of the smart things that I know a couple grantees that I work with did that I thought was really, really clever was they thought about the timing of when money goes into a deal. And not only acquisition, but there are things like soft costs, there are site preparation costs, there's on-site infrastructure, there's pre-development costs like the environmental review or the site assessments, that kind of thing, that happen early in the process. You could pay 100% of those eligible bills and let somebody else pay for back-end costs. And you're still going to get your money in the deal, you're still going to have your percentage of the units, but it gets your money in earlier rather than later. Now, the risk, of course, of doing either of these approaches is what if those other sources fall through? So you've put the NSP money in there, you've acquired the site, you've done the site infrastructure, and maybe you've framed out the building, and then the other money falls through and you don't build the house. That is risky, and that might require a repayment if you had an ineligible unit that never came to, you never finished the unit. So if you want to do this idea of front-loading the money, then you do have to make sure that those other monies that are going to come in and finish the deal are signed on the bottom line and are committed but just not yet available, or you're going to go in first and they're going to go in second, but everybody's on the same page. You don't want to do this without having those other sources committed. Jesse and Hunter, anything to add on that before I keep going?
No, not really. The front loading is risky, but it is a very viable strategy if you need to make up a couple months.
Right. Okay, so where we've seen this issue really coming into play, particularly in NSP2, and we're beginning to see it in NSP3, is tax credits. That a lot of folks have started shifting toward doing more of their NSP money for rental projects. And by definition, if we're serving very low-income people or low-income people, tax credits can be a good resource to couple with NSP to, make our money go farther. The developers like it, all of that. But the issue with tax credits for those of us who've done tax credit deals is that the equity, the payments, don't tend to come in until construction is part of the way through, and then the rest of it doesn't come in until construction is done, and some of it doesn't even come in until after we're fully leased up. And so there is going to be money there from the syndication of the tax credits, but it's not yet there. And so people are waiting for that tax credit money, or they're waiting for the state to issue the credits, and they've been awarded, but they haven't yet got the state paperwork done, whatever it is. Again, NSP can come in, and NSP can be what we would call a bridge lender or a bridge financer, which is that NSP pays for those eligible costs, whether it's acquisition or soft costs or whatever it is, construction costs, while we're waiting for the tax credits, the equity to be paid in. And when it's paid in, we get some or all of it back as NSP program income. That would be a perfectly fine way to do it, and would be a good way to work with tax credits, because there often is this gap issue with tax credits. The only key thing is make sure that the tax credits have actually been awarded, that you have proof of that award, and it's a matter of getting them rather than waiting for the award. Because if the award never comes through, again, you'd have the issue of the project not going to fruition. We've also heard issues about first mortgages, where individuals are having a hard time getting private mortgages. And so we have a home buyer model where we build the unit. The idea is the buyer would come and buy it, but the buyer can't get mortgage financing. So you could decide to act as a first mortgage lender if you wanted to with NSP, which would get a lot of money out there very quickly, because if you think about the value of the first mortgage, it's typically a lot of money. So you could act as a first mortgage lender using NSP money, and in fact, there could be no other mortgage lender. You could be the mortgage lender. Key things about doing that are make sure you've got good underwriting standards so that people are not likely to be, in a foreclosure situation again down the road, and make sure that as a grantee you have a process for collecting those loan payments if you're going to have payments, and how you're going to do that servicing and that tracking of that loan. You could also act as a construction lender. Again, this is extremely difficult money for many developers to get, particularly nonprofit developers who might not have the background of the financial resources that others do. And so you as an NSP grantee could lend the construction financing, some or all of it, and often at a much lower or a 0% interest rate than what I could get on the open market. And in return, I'm going to get repaid when we get to the permanent closing, the permanent takeout, when we've completed the units. Again, there's risk involved in terms of being the construction lender, because there is no unit yet. and so you've got the risk of the unit not actually happening. But taking on that risk can be a good way of getting a lot of NSP money in a project quickly and making it more cost effective because you can lend it out at virtually nothing or at nothing. Another way to do it that a lot of folks have is they've looked at putting NSP money together in a deal. So I know my colleagues in Pennsylvania, for example, have partnered in the state with the city of Pittsburgh to put county and city and state money in a particularly large rental development. That's fine. You can all work together to put, everybody put parts of the NSP money in the deal. Key thing would be know who's investing in what, so that we kind of are able to track the money, and in making sure that the sum of all of those sources of investment, when we put all that NSP money together, is a reasonable investment. 87 talks about cost reasonableness. Just make sure that we're not over-subsidizing this deal by having those different sources in it.
Marcia, one other thing, we want to really urge grantees every time we talk about this sort of thing to get the addresses typed in the same way in every one of the grants that's involved in the same project. So
that way HUD can track the outcomes accurately.
Correct.
Okay, so finally on financing, consider doing a lump sum drawdown. Now, there are a handful of grantees who have tried this, and I will give you forewarning that it is quite complicated legally to get set up. I did some work with Chicago and early on a little bit with New York about how they were doing this, and it does take a number of months. So you may be getting to the end of when this is a tool, particularly for NSP1 and NSP2. But the idea behind it is the private lenders in your community are unwilling to lend without some sort of loan loss reserve or loan guarantee that ensures for them that they will get some portion of their money back should we be unable to sell the unit at a particular price, or should the unit cost more than we anticipate, or whatever it might be, however it's structured. But the idea is that the lender is going to get that guarantee or that loan loss reserve or the risk or part of their risk that they have in this deal. Now, we're not going to fully compensate them. They do have to have some risk in the deal. But the idea that the guarantee pays off for some portion of that lender risk. And so what you do as a grantee then, once that's set up and the legal documents are structured, and I would want to run that past HUD if I were you, is do a lump sum drawdown, deposit the money in this loan loss reserve account or the loan guarantee account for a specific project. So it's not just a big general account that I get to count. It has to be tied to a specific address, and it's sitting there as the loan loss reserve on that specific address to be tapped when and if the lender, had that shortfall that I mentioned. If you do that, and if you do the lump sum drawdown and you've got it tied to a specific address, then at the point at which it is drawn down and in the account for the specific address, and there is a contract with the developer for that specific address, then you can count that money as expended, even though it's sitting in that loan loss reserve account. Because again, it's sort of like the encumbrance conversation we had earlier. It's tied, it's tagged to being able to make that lender whole in the event that that project doesn't pencil out as we had planned. So that's basically the way that the loan loss reserve or loan guarantee works, and a number of big jurisdictions have used it as a way of getting over the goal line and also of incentivizing private lending and getting private leverage. I know in New York, for example, it's really gotten a lot of private leverage into these deals because it incentivized those private lenders. So if you're interested in that, I encourage you to reach out to your colleagues in other jurisdictions. South Florida, I think it's South Florida NHS, Jesse, is that who did it there?
I'm pretty sure it is, but and definitely New York City, but.
And New York City. So yeah, and so reach out to your colleagues, and you can find them on the grantee page of the NSP website. They could share with you their stories about how it has worked. They may be able to share with you some of their documents and so forth. But do know that you have to, there's going to be legal documents involved with those lenders that will have to get sorted out. All right, so let's do a poll about which financing mechanism you found to be successful. So putting money in early, acting as a construction lender, using NSP money as a mortgage source, partnering to jointly invest, innovative tools, other or none. Okay, good. Well, look, investing early. So that's a great tool, and also construction financing. So good. So we're seeing a lot of folks with innovative ideas here about how to put the money in. All right, great. All right, let's jump into the next bucket. So the next chunk was this acquisition and financing, acquisition and construction issues. So we've seen a lot of back and forth, and it depends on which grantee you talk to, about whether the grantee buys the units and then turns them over to a developer or to an individual to then rehab or acquire, or whether we give money directly to a developer or directly to a home buyer, and they go out and find the unit, and then we fund either the acquisition or the construction, but the seeking of the unit and the buying of the unit is done by the individual or the developer. And depending on the jurisdiction, the model has worked both ways. Some places the buyer-driven model has worked, and some places it hasn't. So taking a look at whether or not letting the individual buyers and developers go out and seek out eligible units to purchase rather than having to have the grantee with its administrative processes be the one doing the acquisition. Or on the flip side, if you're having a hard time with the buyer-driven model, taking it back in-house and having the grantee do bulk purchases where they buy a bunch of units and then turn them over to individuals or to developers to do. So take a look at which way you're doing it and see if maybe the other way of thinking about it might help you. Now, whichever way you're doing it, the grantee obviously has to still be in charge. So if you invest power in the individuals or the developers to go out and find units, you guys still have to have a process for reviewing those units, making sure that the units are eligible, that they meet the appraisal requirements, if it's foreclosed, all those sorts of issues. So you still have to have that oversight process. And you may have to have some sort of clearinghouse where those individuals or developers know where to go look. So how do they know, what neighborhoods to look in, what are the available units? And so there are some grantees who have websites where they gather the available listings, whether that comes from FHA or FDIC or local lenders, and they then share those listings with potential eligible buyers, be they developers or individuals, and those individuals can go hunt among that list in their target neighborhood. So it's important to help with those kinds of tools if you want to have a buyer-driven model. Now, again, for some folks, buyer-driven hasn't worked. And so the alternate is, as a grantee, rather than trying to go unit by unit and buy unit by unit within your target areas, there are some grantees who've been successful at making bulk purchase deals with REO sellers. So you go to the big lender in your community, and if they have 50 units in your target neighborhoods, cut a deal to buy 40 of those 50 units or 30 of those 50 units or however many you think you need in bulk, in one big chunk, and hopefully at more than a 1% discount, but if it's foreclosed, at least at a 1% discount. That's a big chunk of money. If you buy all those units in bulk, sort of warehouse them, and then you can sell them off to developers and to individuals. And I know that Mercy Housing in Chicago, for example, have this warehouse concept that they have worked through there, and I think others have as well. Okay, so what if you can't find foreclosed units? And as I said, this was one of the most common things we heard back as we talked to folks. Where do I go to find? I'm running out of stock. Where do I find them? So there are good sources out there for foreclosed units. If you are not currently participating in FHA First Look, particularly if you're a new grantee, maybe under NSP3, and you haven't heard about this or aren't sure, FHA First Look is a program under FHA, but they also have Fannie and Freddie's units or some of their units, where if you are a public or a nonprofit purchaser and you're going to be the purchaser, it's not that you're giving money to an individual, but you are actually buying units, you can get qualified or pre-qualified by FHA to then participate in this program. And once you're qualified, you get, for a specific period of time, a first look at available units in your target area and sort of have first dibs on buying those units as a nonprofit or a public agency at a discounted price. Now, after that time frame, of course, it goes out to investors and so forth, but it gives you a first chance. Now, that only works if you, as a public agency or nonprofit developer or recipient, are actually buying the properties. It doesn't work if you have a buyer-driven model. FDIC also has a similar kind of listing, and many of you probably have a lot of FDIC units in your community. Those units might be residential, but they also do have vacant land. They have a lot of failed subdivisions that they've taken back, and there is some commercial and other kinds of space as well. And if you go to the FDIC website, you can learn more about. They have a lot of resources. They have listing of those units that you can look at within your jurisdiction. There also are some contact folks there. They have an email distribution system where they send out lists every couple of weeks about available units. So if you're not partnering with FDIC, particularly there are 8 states where they really have a concentration of these units, you may want to reach out to them. And so they actually authorized me to let you guys know that if you want to get on their list or want to learn more about them, you can email Marilyn Flook, so it's MFLOOK @fdic.gov, and they can tell you more about the units they have available. Finally, if none of that works, and you could also obviously be working with the National Trust as well, there are grantees who have come up with their own First Look program, a locally developed First Look program with either regional branches of big national banks or even with local lending institutions and so forth. And so what they've done, and I know that there are pockets of this around the country, is those lenders are willing to send over their lists of pending or short sale units or pending sale units to the local jurisdiction. The local jurisdiction works with that lender to decide if they want to buy those units before they put them out to the public for purchasing. So it's like the FHA program, except that it's sort of locally determined. So if FHA isn't working for you, if there aren't any other resources, sit down with your local lenders and see what you can work out. Particularly regional lenders and locally based lending institutions have been open to this. We did get a question in the pre-session about short sales, whether short sales can count. Yes. As of the October 2010 notice, when the definitions, and actually it was prior to that, when the definitions were changed about what is foreclosed, short sales can be considered a part of the foreclosed inventory. There are some constraints about how delinquent it has to be and some things like that, so there's more to it. But see the notice from October of last year for that definition, which talks about short sales as being eligible. And then finally, if none of that works and you can't find foreclosed units, then take a look at whether or not you have a lot of vacant land or obsolete buildings that under eligible use E you actually could do under NSP. And that may involve an action plan change, but there may be a lot of vacant land even if there's not a lot of foreclosed or abandoned structures. So Jesse, anything to add on any of those? I know you guys have worked hard on that FHA First Look program.
We work very hard on the FHA First Look. We work on it through the National Community Stabilization Trust, also for the greater First Look, which is now handling the FHA stuff as well. And we have maps where you can. They have the NSP target area maps, and so they can show properties in your target areas for you. So I think it's. If you're not participating, you really ought to take a look at it. Even if you end up looking at several properties before you buy one, at least you know about everything that's happening in your area. Plus, the reverse lookup function of the National Community Stabilization Trust website, REO Match, is really handy. So if you're driving around a neighborhood and there's an abandoned property that you think would be incredibly useful for purposes of stabilizing the neighborhood, you can get them to look it up for you and tell you who the owner is, which can be really, really, really handy to have.
Great. All right, so we talked about bundling, the idea of buying multiple properties, but there also is the idea of selling multiple properties to a developer. So rather than selling them on a one-by-one deal, bundle the units that you, the grantee, have found or have acquired, sell them off in a bunch to developers to do concurrent development to those sites, which obviously would help to speed up the expenditures. If you don't have enough developers, consider broadening your pool. Send out a new RFP or a new NOFA, and get more developers on board. Another way that folks, particularly under NSP2, have been moving construction money quickly is considering manufactured modular housing, which is built in a factory and assembled on site. And a lot of those manufactured modular housing require an upfront payment of that construction contract, and then the balance of the 50% upon delivery of those component parts. that obviously gets the money spent quickly because you're not waiting for the construction to occur. You have to pay that up front, that portion up front, and that counts as expended. So, that's another way that folks have looked at this. There are some folks who have had a hard time finding qualified developers and qualified contractors who have just gone out and done the deals directly, whether they went directly to contractors and didn't have developers, or they worked through the housing authority who has on-staff construction folks who did minor repair, minor rehab. And there are even some of those folks who have built into those processes where they are managing the construction, job training, workforce development kinds of things as part of those. So kids in high school learning about the construction trades or partnering with some of the local unions. So consider, that kind of thing as well. Finally, one of the ones that people did under NSP2 that I think proved very successful was bulk purchasing of materials, so construction materials is what we're talking about here, for specific projects. So this only is for, it's not just buying it for the heck of it, not kind of knowing what deal it's going in, but for specific sites where you know you're going to need 200 windows for this rental project, buying those windows in bulk, which saves you money but gets the expense today, and securely storing those materials until they need to be installed in the specific project. So it does have to be a reasonable time frame. You can't buy for stuff that's 5 years from now. It has to be, in the near reasonable future that you're going to use those materials. And you obviously do have to securely store those materials because obviously if the materials are broken or stolen, you can't pay twice. You'd have to have them insured so that you could, make sure that it actually gets into the project. And you'd have to have a property tracking system to make sure that if you bought 100 windows, that 100 windows went into the NSP project. So assuming you have that structure in place, a number of grantees have used this as a way to speed up their expenditures. I think we'll skip, in the interest of time, I'm going to skip a couple of polls here just to keep us going and move on to capacity. So one of the things that we've seen across the country is that there are a number of grantees who just don't have enough in-house capacity to handle the volumes they need to get to the expenditure deadline. And there are a number of grantees who are not bumping up against the 10% administrative cap or are not actually charging activity delivery costs to be able to manage these programs. And so there is an opportunity to hire more staff or contract out for more staff or find more subrecipients to really expand your capacity. And you can get help in trying to figure and build those skills through NSPTA or some of the other sources. You can also look at your internal processes and see, what's slow for us. What do we need to do to make ourselves move more quickly? So look particularly around your accounting processes. I know a number of grantees who only take invoices once a month or who only make payments every other month or something, or it takes them 2 months to make a payment. Looking at those kind of processes and maybe just for NSP, coming up with sort of a special provision to get billed more frequently and to pay those bills more frequently so that you get credit. And then also making sure that your process of getting it into the QPR and getting credit is also working as well. The environmental review process, as I mentioned earlier, is one of those places where we know a number of people are having some issues. Take a look at how it's working. Can you do tiered reviews if you are not currently? If the issue is the volume that you have and getting it through your system, can you contract out for environmental experts to support you? There are a number of grantees. I believe this happened in Minnesota, but I think it also happened in other places where the grantees created streamlined processes for the environmental reviews, still in compliance with the laws, but ways of doing some of the paperwork a little more quickly, both with the environmental office as well as the historic preservation offices. So, if you're a grantee or if you're working with a state, reach out to those part of your state and see if there's a way to kind of streamline that process. They could talk to other state colleagues who have taken that on. And if you don't know about states that have tried that, I'd recommend reaching out to some of the state associations like COSCA or NCSHA. They have listservs and things that they can reach out to other states and give you some ideas about that. The other thing is that we're finding across the country, and it's happening everywhere, but particularly for some of the states and the urban counties, where you have multiple sub-recipients or sub-grantees that you have funded or developers you've funded, where some of those folks are moving faster than others are moving. Now is the time to do that assessment because we're getting closer to the end of the deadlines here. Take a look at which state recipients, which sub-recipients, which developers are successful. And more likely than not, you're going to find some of your portfolio where that partner is moving the money really, really quickly and has lots of program income and is right on top of it. And then you're going to find other partners where the money's just sitting there. It's politically difficult, obviously not to understate that, but it's a difficult thing to do. But now is the time to say, you know what, this grantee is not performing, this one is. We're going to reallocate some or all of your money to this one who is performing. Obviously, you have to take into account where the need is and your action plan, but it's time to do that assessment because we're getting, again, to the point where several months from now, 6 months from now, reallocating will be too late. So now is the time to really be thinking about, is it time to move money around among our projects? You do want to look at your grant agreement with that partner and make sure that, you've written in a clause that allows the grantee, or if it's the subrecipient doing this, to make those changes. And if your contracts don't allow you that power, make sure the ones you sign going forward do. You probably don't have to do a substantial amendment if you're moving money from a partner you're already funding to another partner that you are already funding. So it's a matter of a little more money here and a little less money there. That would not be a substantial amendment, although HUD would like it if you would inform the field office. You do have to do a substantial amendment, however, if it's a brand new activity that you want to try out, like you've never done activity E before and now you want to do it, or you're hitting a different beneficiary group, so you're no longer going to serve very low income, but you're going to serve moderate income or whatever, or if that moving around with money changes your target areas and you want to go into a different target area. I'm going to skip this poll and keep going. So the last sort of section of tools has to do with reinvigorating the demand for your units. And so that starts really with the design of your program and look at whether or not there have been some changes since you designed the program a couple of years ago. Have our target areas changed? Have the households need to serve changed? Has the market changed in terms of the kinds of units or the financing available? And again, now is the time to look at redesigning your program to have enough time to get that done and really get it into place. So look at whether or not we need to change from rental to owner, or we need to put more money in these deals, or we need a different kind of financing, or we need different partners. And if you find that you do want to redesign, the NSP toolkits, which are on the NSP website and are sorted by activity type, will give you some tools to design those new programs. Again, you need to decide whether it's going to be a substantial amendment with that program redesign. It would only occur if you're adding a new activity, again, new target area, change in the beneficiaries whom you're serving. A little more here, a little less there does not require you to do a substantial amendment. But again, HUD would like you to reach out to the field office and just make sure everybody agrees on that. Now for NSP2, changing some of these things, major things like the activity you're going to do or where you're going to do it, would require rescoring, and that could be prohibitive in terms of changing what you're doing. Jesse, do you want to add a word about substantial amendments?
Just that they don't, remember there's waivers on the citizen participation timeframes and stuff. They don't have to take as long as some grantees tell us they take. Particularly for NSP1 and 3, you have a lot of control over it. Just remember, citizens need to know how they're going to be affected and just get out there and do it. If your program's aimed at the wrong thing, if your market's moved on, change with it.
Okay, great. Now, finally, if the issue that you're facing is just getting the units sold, you've got a lot of units out there, you've got home buyer financing that you've pledged, but there's nobody taking advantage of it because nobody's buying the units, so you've got money sitting there because it isn't going to the home buyers. Hey, assuming you've done an analysis and you know that you've got, your program is well targeted, then take a look at how you're doing your marketing. And I will give a plug we're going to have webinars later this month and early next month, I should say March and April, about disposition and marketing. And so pay attention, come into those webinars to learn more details. But take a look at how you're doing that kind of outreach and that kind of marketing. And we do have an example of a process that was used by NHS in South Florida, and I'll show you their little marketing flyer. And they have a whole process they've put together for how they reach out to realtors and communities, and they were kind enough to share that. So we'll try to find a way to get, if they'll let us, and we'll ask for their permission, get that up on the website so that other folks can see it, because it appears to be a process that's working well. Do look at whether or not there really is a market for these home buyer units. And it may turn out that, the units have been sitting on the market for too long, and what we really need to do is, move it into rental and sell the units over to a nonprofit to do scattered site rental rather than home ownership. And somewhere down the road, you might later then sell those units. But for now, what's needed in our market, what's demanded in our market is rental. Similarly, it might be that lease purchase, could be a way of getting in some home buyers who wouldn't normally have qualified with the idea that they're renting and then they will eventually become an owner. Obviously, you need to be careful about that program design and make sure that you know at what point they become an owner, what happens if they don't become an owner, and so forth. So here's a copy of the postcard from the folks in South Florida. It was an example of how they do outreach, and again, we'll hopefully be able to share with you some of their other tools. So I'm going to skip that one, and I think Jesse and Hunter, if it's okay with you guys, maybe we'll take some questions now, and then we can come back to the case studies if we have to.
We agree.
Okay.
Let's go to the questions.
All right, so let's take questions. So let's begin with the phone line. So Cynthia, can you take our first phone line?
And a reminder to the phone audience, if you would like to ask a question, you may do so by pressing the star key followed by the digit 1 on your touch-tone telephone. And if you find your question has been asked and answered, you may press star 2 to remove yourself from the queue. Again, that's star 1 to ask a question, and we'll pause for just a moment to allow everyone the opportunity to signal. And we do have a question from Patricia. Please go ahead.
Hi, Patricia.
Yes, I was going back to when they talked about drawing the money down in advance. I thought that once you drew the money down, it had to be spent toward a specific item within a certain time frame. For example, I'm in a purchase assist, and we do $25,000 for rehab. So far, I've been successful in the bank's funding the first mortgage as the home is. But if I come into a situation where the bank says we need to have that floor put in first, or we need the AC unit put in first, I was under the understanding I couldn't do an escrow holdback because I couldn't, I can't spend the money until after the home is closed, we have the contractors go in and do a bid, and that's going to be 2 weeks, and then 45 days from then.
Yeah, short of doing a lump sum drawdown, which may or may not be applicable to the way you're designing the program, you're right that you cannot draw the funds in advance of using them. You can't draw down the money and just hold it, except in this lump sum drawdown exception that I talked about.
Right, that's the general truth, Martha. There are a few occasions where, and these are mostly for large multifamily projects, where it happens with new market tax credit projects, where the IRS, another federal agency, has written a rule that says all the funds have to be in a certain place at a certain time before you can move forward. If there is like another requirement playing through, the funds can be drawn, but we do not count them as expended. Some of the largest gaps between drawn and expended have been explained by grantees who are doing new market tax credit deals, and we definitely keep an eye on those. There's a couple of other kinds of tax credits that will cause situations like that, and in a couple of states, some lenders have requirements for funding being in place, or they will not provide their funds. They're not that common. It doesn't seem to be happening single family. It's something that happens in multifamily.
Yeah, well, mine is strictly single-family purchase assist, and I just wish, it would make so much sense if we're doing the homes that have been foreclosed and vacant 90 days, and they've been trashed by people moving out or damaged, and the bank doesn't want to fund as is, that I would be able to have an escrow holdback for a 2-month period or a 45-day period at least to get the work done.
It may make sense in terms of the market, but the U.S. Treasury in a deficit situation will not allow funds to be drawn in advance of need, and if they don't allow it, HUD can't allow it.
Okay.
So there might be a way to think about your construction process.
Yeah.
So that you're making a commitment of funding to the construction, whoever's been chosen as the construction contractor, and you can look at your own internal processes about how quickly you draw and how quickly you pay, so that there doesn't have to be a big gap between when they outlay the funds for the rehab and when you pay them. So
I don't have any problem with that. The minute that the home closes, we have this scheduled bid tour of all the contractors that come and bid. They have a week to bid. We choose within 2 days, and then I do the contract, and they get started within a few days.
Okay.
And then they get it done within 45 days, and then I pay them when they're done.
Well, you don't have to pay them when you're done. You could pay in the interim. You could change your process to say, we're not going to pay you at completion of the construction. We're going to let you bill on completion of line items.
So if they went and bought the fridge, I could pay them for the materials or the appliance.
Yes, you can create a schedule, like a payment schedule, the way banks do.
Yeah.
That obviously
work for you, though.
Yeah, it's a paperwork headache for you.
It is more work, so yeah.
But at least it would get the money paid quickly.
Right. Yeah, that hasn't been so much of an issue. It's just been more, I've been more limited in houses because if the bank won't fund and I can't do an escrow holdback, then I can't use that house.
Okay.
That's
yeah, I mean, again, maybe there's some way to talk to some of your local lenders and to talk about the meaning of your commitment. It's signed by your executive director or whoever, as sort of being a firm commitment to that property. I mean, there may be something along those lines that you could do.
Yeah, I've done my best to reassure them that the money's here at the county waiting to be spent. We have it, we'll do it, but they, larger banks aren't that happy about that.
Yeah. Is there any way to? No, you're doing the acquisition we're doing
Purchase
the money going?
It's consumer-driven, buyer-driven.
Okay.
We don't acquire anything.
Because I'm wondering whether there's a way to consider, rather than having separate acquisition financing from the construction financing, to roll them into one, so that you're actually running the money through the buyer rather than you're paying the construction contractor directly.
Well, the banks don't want any cash going to the buyer.
Well, you wouldn't really. I mean, the buyer would submit the bill to you. You'd pay the bill, but it would be working through the buyer.
Yeah. If the banks don't want to go there, you're kind of stuck.
But if the work isn't done?
Oh, that's done all the time. That basically the buyer is the one with the relationship with the contractor, and you're not paying the buyer. You're paying the contractor, but the buyer is sort of the one who's in charge of that process. That's done all the time in CDBG. So that might be something.
Well, that is kind of what I'm doing, but it's all after the purchase.
Yeah. Right. Again, I still think you could look at prior to the purchase. Assuming you know the unit, you know what the buyer, they've chosen the buyer, you could start getting those contractors in earlier.
How the contractors bid before we close?
Yeah. Yeah, there's no reason you couldn't do that.
Okay.
If you know that that's the house you're going to close on.
And once again, how do I involve the buyer instead of the contractors when I'm paying the contractors directly? I mean, I have a contract I prepare between the owner and the contractor.
Okay.
Yeah.
And they're choosing the contractor?
We're choosing a contractor based on the lowest bidding through our procurement requirements.
Hey guys, we're getting really deep in the weeds on a really specific case. So can we recommend this would be a classic for on-call TA. If you put in a request for on-call TA and mark that this was a discussion on the webinar, we will get it taken care of for you within a week and turn someone around to really talk through this with you.
Okay. And how do I do that?
You go to the NSP Resource Exchange, www.hud.gov/NSPTA, and there's a button there over the word request, and just fill out the information there. It basically asks who you are and how to get back to you and what your issue is.
Great.
And we assign those every week, either Wednesday evening or Thursday morning.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Great. Okay, perfect. Do we have anybody else on the phone, Cynthia?
There are currently no participants in the queue. Again, star 1 if you'd like to ask a question.
Okay, so let me go into the written-in questions then. We have a question from Heather. Despite the speakers touching on this subject a slide ago, this question may be somewhat off base, so if this question cannot be answered in the setting, please ignore. We have all the proper covenants attached to our down payment assistance that is required. However, we've identified situations that could occur in the future that will require our agency to initiate the foreclosure process if someone defaults on those covenants, and we're the only lien holder. What are the steps the grantee needs to start this process? So it sounds like to start the foreclosure process, I think, Heather, may be what you're asking. I'm not totally sure exactly what you're asking. And again, if that's what it is, I think you need to talk to your local or city or county attorney about how that works, because that would be different in each jurisdiction. The process is different in different jurisdictions. But I'm not quite sure if that's what you're asking. Jesse or Hunter, do you guys have any thoughts about that?
Not really. If she's asking how HUD would view a grantee foreclosing for cause, we would go look at the continuing affordability requirements, make sure that the funds that the program was owed came back to it. It's okay to spend general admin on due diligence like that, you know, following up on your own requirements. And the funds coming back are recaptured. I don't believe they're actually program income, although I would have to ask Paul Webster that question.
I don't believe so either, Jesse, because I think in essence it would have become an ineligible project.
I think they're a repayment of grant.
Right, I think that's right. Okay, so Heather, hopefully that answered your question, but if it doesn't, feel free to call in and we can go from there. Okay, Mark has a question. Can land banking work as a strategy to expend funds for acquisition while having time to actually develop or rehab the property? This wasn't part of our original action plan. How hard is it to shift funds from another activity type to land banking? So yes, land banking actually could be a good way. It goes back to that idea of using acquisition as a way of speeding up NSP funds. So in essence, what land banking is acquisition, right? So you could go out and acquire units or land which are within your specific target areas and hold that land or those units in a land bank, and you need to have a process for maintaining those units and overseeing those units and so forth for some period of time. And then when you know what you want to do with those units, when your market recovers, pulling them out of the land bank and putting them into another eligible use. So assuming that it's not like a instant kind of a turnover thing, but you really are going to hold them for a while, then land banking might very well be a good way of getting some money spent quickly. I wouldn't recommend land banking and going through that whole process of holding it and maintaining them and figuring out the disposition and everything if your intent is to hold it for a couple of weeks and then sell it off to a developer where you know what you're going to do. In that case, just do the development activity. But if you really don't know what you're going to do and need time to figure out the plan and figure out the market, then land banking might be a good way to go. If you don't have land banking, which is one of the eligible uses in your current action plan, then that would be a new activity, and that would require a substantial amendment. But as Jesse said, there are some fairly rapid ways of doing the public comment and everything. And you would have to go back out for that brief comment period, reallocate the money from one use that you are doing to whatever you want to have in the land bank, whether it's program income or whether it's direct grant funds, and go through the HUD approval process. But people have been finding that substantial amendments really are not all that burdensome. Anything to add to that, Jesse?
Yeah, we both do.
Well, you go first.
Well, my point on land banks is just, if you're looking at the end game at closeout, land banks, you're only allowed to hold the property in the land bank for 10 years under the NSP notice. Before we go to closeout, we haven't worked out the exact details yet, but we are going to expect the grantees that have land banks to have a plan for how they're going to get the properties out of those land banks. And we are going to be creating and tracking a registry of properties held in land banks, probably by transferring the list of properties held in land banks into IDIS. So we're not going to lose sight of those properties. We're going to keep on this over time. So when you're thinking about a land bank, and you should also be thinking about how you get out of it. It's not property that you can just hold forever and ever. You need to think about what you're going to use that property for or how you're going to dispose of it.
And I just wanted to point out that we'll be doing a land bank webinar in April that will cover all of this and much more.
Yeah, so please join that webinar because I think it'll give you some tips about that long-term plan that Jesse was mentioning. But Mark, it sounds like it might actually be a good technique. Particularly, there are a lot of markets where we just can't sell these houses right now, and we don't even know whether they want to be very low income or demolished or whatever. So, you know, waiting out that market, it might be that land banking is a good strategy. Okay, we have a question written in from Susan. In reference to not being able to find units to purchase and rehab through NSP3, properties seem to have dried up, especially those for very low and low-income families. have used most of the sources you recommended to find units. So, this is an example of a changing market where Susan is located. And again, I think one idea is look beyond just foreclosed units. Many communities may in fact have dried up foreclosed units, but they may also have vacant units. They may have abandoned units. So first see if there are any of those kinds of units are available. The other thing is to look at your target area and see whether there's a way for you to expand that target area. And I think Susan's just written it a little bit more. She said our target area is very concentrated, but an area that has been very active in foreclosure in the last 18 months. Can we, and how difficult would it be to enlarge our target area at this point? Banks in the local area may be holding back so as not to flood the market so as not to flood the local market and lower values. Plus, there's competition with investors now. We have no trouble with finding families, so they're probably finding the units, not the families for Susan's community. So it's not difficult to increase your target area as long as you can show that the market has changed and that there is, in fact, a broader area where there's a concentration of foreclosed and abandoned units. So it would be a matter of gathering that data and then going back in with it would be a substantial amendment to change or enlarge your target area. So if you had a very small target area, it may be that you need to have a broader area in order to have the program be feasible. So it's not a hard thing to do, but you have data to back that up. Hunter or Jesse, anything to add on that?
No, seriously, the most common substantial amendment is to change the target area because the market has turned on you. And it's getting better, and you just need to move on to another place where it's still bad.
Or bigger. In her case, I think she might have made her target area very small, and really she needs to make it, however much bigger.
Yeah. And
okay, so hopefully that helps. And again, if you have questions about how to do that, you can go on to the NSPTA website and send in a request for help, and folks can walk you through it, or your field office can certainly help you as well. The substantial amendment does not have to be hard. Okay, the next question is from Gail. We have a property right next to one of our NSP properties. We'd love to acquire and rehabilitate. It appears to be vacant. Earlier I heard you say something about a way to look up who the owner might be so we might be able to acquire it. I do know there is no mortgage against it and the taxes have been kept current. Would the property even be eligible? If so, can you explain a little more detail how to look up who the owner might be? So the question is whether or not the unit is in fact vacant, abandoned, or foreclosed.
Right.
And it sounds like it's neither abandoned nor foreclosed because it sounds like it says that there's no mortgage and the taxes have been paid, so it's not in a delinquency sort of situation. So the only way that unit would be eligible is if, in fact, it's vacant, and you'd have to be able to verify that. So if you can verify that the unit is vacant, it's not just vacant for this weekend, but it's been vacant, then yes, and we'll come back and talk about how to do that. But if indeed you can verify that the unit is vacant, then under eligible use E, you could redevelop that. You could acquire and rehab it or tear it down or whatever it is that you want to do with that unit. Looks like foreclosed and abandoned would not be an option for you here. So if that's the case, then you need to be able to figure out whether it's vacant or not. So you could. Gail just wrote in. It is vacant and almost falling down. Okay, so it sounds like it in fact would qualify as a vacant unit. So what I would recommend you do is go to your tax office and see who the owner of record is, because somebody's paying those taxes. So your tax office must know who it is who's paying those taxes. And then you could reach out to that owner and offer to do a voluntary acquisition of that vacant unit and make sure you follow the voluntary acquisition rules that would come with that. And then, acquire it from them for a reasonable price. That would be my suggestion for how to find them. Any other ideas, Hunter or Jesse?
Nope. That sounds like a good start.
Yeah, and so you should be able to find them that way because, as I said, somebody must be paying the taxes. And then, if they agree to sell to you, then, of course, make sure that in your action plan you've got eligible use E, redevelopment, as one of your activities you're planning, and then under eligible use E, you could go in and acquire and reconstruct or rehabilitate that property. Okay, so that's the last written-in question that we have. And again, folks that wrote in, if we didn't cover it, please feel free to write back in. Anybody on the phone, Cynthia?
Yes, we will go to Christy. Please go ahead.
Hi, Christy.
Good afternoon. I have a quick question for you. In assisting the home buyers that are below 50% AMI in acquiring homes in the market, we have a dual purpose. One is to stabilize the neighborhood. So the price points are a little bit higher due to the homes that we found in a stable neighborhood. We're addressing the foreclosed properties. But those price points are just a little bit high for 50% AMI. So one of the strategies has been to provide additional down payment assistance to those home buyers. In that case, is there any limit to the amount of down payment assistance that you can provide to, or maximum you can provide to 50% home buyers, or would you suggest the strategy would be to further subsidize the price of the home? Because we're trying to stabilize the values in the neighborhood as well as assist home buyers who are below 50% to move into the neighborhood.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, yes, there is a limitation on how much you can do as, quote, a down payment. And I say that as quote because you'll see there's other ways to get money in the deal. So for the part that's the down payment that you explicitly set up as a down payment, you're only allowed to pay 50% of whatever the lender is requiring. And I assume there's a private lender that's lending to this buyer, right?
Yes, and let me modify my question. Principal reduction as well.
Okay.
So we're doing some principal reduction as well.
Okay. So in terms of what you call a down payment, you can only pay 50% of whatever the lender has said. So if the lender said $10,000 is needed as the down payment on this house, you could only pay $5,000. But you can put other money in to help this home buyer in lots of other ways. So there's no limitation on principal reduction. There's no limitation on closing cost assistance. There's no limitation on your mortgage lending if you want to be a second mortgage lender, a soft, second forgivable, whatever it is. So what I would recommend looking at is what can the very low-income buyers that you're trying to serve, what is it that they can afford, and what is a lender willing to lend them, and then compare that to the market value of the houses that you have available in this community, and you'll find that there's a gap, right? The houses are worth $80,000, they can only afford $50,000, and a lender's willing to lend them $40,000 or whatever it might be. You can then look at those gaps, and you can say, okay, well, I'll give them a soft second loan for the difference between the value of the property and what they can afford and what the lender will lend to them. And in addition to that soft second loan, which is really acting like a principal reduction, I'll also give them half of the down payment or the closing costs or whatever you want to also do. So you can combine all those sources of subsidy together in order to help that home buyer and without changing the purchase price. Because what people are concerned about is what you want the HUD-1 to show, the sale price to show, is that it's at the value or somewhere near the value of the property, because you don't want to depress that neighborhood just because you're helping a very low-income family. So you could have the sale price be at whatever the market value or some small discount off the market value, and then your subsidy is really what's making up the difference, your forgivable, deferred, soft second principal reduction. Does that make sense?
It does. And if I was to recap what you said, that we still want to stabilize the values, determine what our home buyers that are below 50% can qualify for, and then figure out how we provide that gap. And it can be in a multiple different ways that we're doing that for the home buyer,
exactly,
including down payment, principal reduction, and closing cost assistance.
Exactly. And
okay.
Again, or you could be a second mortgage lender. You can decide however you want to put those tools together. Just make sure that the part you call a down payment is 50%, no more than 50% of what the lender says they require.
Thank you so much.
Jesse or Hunter, anything to add to that?
No, I thought that was a rather tidy explanation.
Okay, great. All right, anybody else on the phone, Cynthia?
No further phone questions.
Okay, and how about, I don't see anybody written in. So maybe we'll just take a minute and just do one or two of the cases, and then we'll take a few more, I'll just do one of the cases, and then we'll take a few more questions. And for the other cases we don't get to, we can certainly put up answers on the website. So we had the case example was the grantees acquiring the units. They're selling the units to a nonprofit developer at a below market cost. The developer uses private money to rehab and then sells them at the market value. And this is a fairly common model. And we're seeing issues in these kinds of models with finding units in the specifically foreclosed units in the market area, target area. The nonprofit developers are not really participating and are kind of slow to move forward. And when they finally do have the units for sale, they're moving slowly. So, Jesse or Hunter, ideas about how someone could address that could tweak that kind of a program?
Marsha, I'm sorry, did you ask us something? We were having discussion.
Sure. I was asking you guys, given this kind of a program model, how might you tweak the program? And for example, a suggestion might be that we don't have to just focus on foreclosed properties. We could look at abandoned and vacant properties that are in our target area. We could open up the program to be more than just nonprofit developers. We could allow for-profit developers to participate. And we could also help to fund the rehab rather than having private rehab on this kind of a project. Any other ideas?
I always fall back on first cases. Are we stuck because we don't have a problem, or our problem has changed? I always, if a program gets stuck really hard and there's not an obvious procedural hurdle, it's a market thing. I always at least ask myself that question first.
Yeah, Jesse's right, because if the units are sitting on the market for a long time, it may be that there isn't demand for homebuyer units in your community, and that what you need to be doing is looking at doing rental activities or demolition or land banking, which may in fact be what's demanded in your community.
I mean, you may have in your mind that you have a certain kind of problem, but that may not be true anymore. And so you always have to say, am I stuck because the problem changed and I'm solving the wrong thing?
Okay.
And then you get by that. A lot of times that's not true. You still have a big problem in a lot of our target areas, but you should at least ask, because we're definitely seeing movement in the economy in a lot of NSP areas, which is a good thing.
Great. All right, the next case had to do with home and tax credits together, so the NSP and tax credits together, and we're seeing that much more commonly than we used to. And what people are doing is they're putting the NSP in proportionately with the tax credits, in other words, at the same point in time, and that is this issue with the timing. And so think about how to put NSP money in early, as I mentioned, the acquisition, the demolition, those kinds of activities, and then let the tax credits that come in later in the process pay for the later phases of the construction. Work with your state tax credit folks to try to get some movement in the timing of the paperwork. Again, they probably can't move the syndication, but they could certainly, get those award paperwork and whatnot done more quickly. Look at your own internal processes to make sure that you are able to process the invoices more quickly. And in this example, we were saying that they were a little bit slow to take credit for what they had expended, and so look at their process for getting money into QPR. And then finally, the last case we had was a buyer-driven model, where we provide acquisition of financing directly to the home buyers, and the grantee then does the underwriting and the buyers go out and buy the units. And what's happening is that we're losing out to investors, which is a very common situation. So how might we address that? There are grantees who have decided to give up on the buyer-driven model and do the acquisition themselves or work via a developer. So you might take a look at whether or not revamping the process in that way might move things more quickly. You might also take a look at what you can partner with your lenders so that perhaps the buyers and the units are more attractive to them by changing your underwriting criteria, working with them in terms of reviewing those loans in partnership, those sorts of things, and then, beefing up your staff to be able to do these kinds of projects more quickly. So that's a quick overview. We have some more ideas for these kinds of cases, and we'll put those up when we put up the PowerPoints for the webinar. With that, Cynthia, do we have any more questions on the line?
And as a reminder, if you'd like to ask a question through your phone line, press *1.
Okay. And Gail, it looks like you might have more of a question. So if you do, please press *1. I can't see the question you're writing in, so press *1 if you have more questions. And again, any other last questions? We're coming up on the end of our time together, but any last questions, *1 on your phone.
We do have a question in the phone queue. We will go to Gail. Please go ahead.
Hi, Gail.
Hi, Marcia. This is Gail Brownlee with Wyoming. And I was the one that wrote in about the NSP property that we had one that was right next door. Okay. And somewhere along the line, I guess, I have missed out on the definition of the foreclosed, abandoned, because this is really intriguing me because we've got this thing falling down. I believe this gentleman is a vet that is in a nursing home. Nobody seems to want to buy this property. It's perfect for trying to get it rehabbed. But since there was no mortgage on it and the taxes have been kept current, I thought part of the abandoned definition was that there couldn't have been mortgage payments or tax payments for a certain period of time. Is there something I'm missing that if it's vacant and falling apart that we can make an offer and it's still a eligible property under Use E for redevelopment?
Yeah, so it's really the definition of vacant as opposed to the definition of abandoned or foreclosed. So it sounds from the facts you've put forward that it probably doesn't meet the definition of abandoned or foreclosed because the payments are being made and, it's not delinquent and it's not, there's not a lender, threatening to foreclose or anything like that. And they're up on their tax payments and everything else. So I don't think it would qualify as vacant, as abandoned or foreclosed.
But what she said was that there were code violations, so that you have to crawl back through and say, was the owner notified and have they failed to respond for, what did we say, 90 days?
90 days, yeah.
So,
and I'm not sure if there have been code violations. I mean, of all of the properties on the street, it looks like it's really bad. The windows are busted out. It's not really habitable, but I don't know if the city has ever actually cited them for anything because all of it appears to be internal. And, so far it's not creating a health hazard unless somebody breaks in.
So there still could be code violations that if there's plumbing or electrical issues, which there frequently are if somebody's been stealing the wires and the pipes, you can have open sewer conditions, and you get the code guys in there and get them to make the code violation, even though it's internal to the unit. That can be a health and safety issue, a fire or a public health issue.
But they would still have to notify the owner, right, Jesse?
Yes,
and
then they have a set period of time to respond. If they fail to respond, the property becomes abandoned by the NSP definition and fair game.
Now, the other way to do it, though, that I think you were asking about, Gail, was vacant, right? So you said nobody has been living there. I think you could make a case that if there is nobody physically living in that building, and there hasn't been, and you can document that, and perhaps the owner would be willing to, or the owner's family, depending on the nature, to document that, I think you could make a case that under eligible use E, that it's vacant. So remember, the vacant definition is different than the definition for abandoned or foreclosed. You don't have to meet that whole delinquency thing with a vacant. That vacant is simply that it's vacant.
I guess I just sort of missed that one because that would be cool, and especially if we were helping out a former vet, be able to get rid of a property that could be a burden if he's sitting in a nursing home and still get some funds out of it, and then we can help the neighborhood. It's a win-win.
Yeah, I mean, Jesse, I don't see any reason why she couldn't do that as long as she can document that it is in fact vacant.
And we've had the property next door to it for 2 years, rehabbing it, acquiring it, going through the environmental, rehabbing it, all of this kind of stuff. So we've witnessed that it's been vacant for, year and a half, 2 years.
Jesse, what do you think?
I never answer the what do you think kind of questions over the phone. I'd have to see the documentation, but it definitely sounds like a possibility.
So maybe, Cynthia, consider writing it in to the Ask a Question on the NSP website and give the facts about why you know that it's vacant.
But or just talk to your rep. Seriously, this is a straight-up compliance question. You may not need TA so much as you just need to talk to your NSP specialist, and they can talk to the NSP team, and we should be able to get you a straight up or down answer pretty fast on the eligibility or what documentation you would need.
But don't forget, as I said, the definition of vacant is very different than the definition of foreclosed or abandoned.
Right.
You don't have to apply the same rules to vacant. So, work for your Denver field office, but it sounds like you guys make your case for why it's vacant.
Right, and the limitation on eligible use is that the property must be used for housing.
And that's exactly what we'd want to put it back. It's in a single-family neighborhood, and we'd want it back in the single-family program to an eligible buyer. Our program is currently at 80% or less rather than 120.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it sounds like you have a reasonable, just make sure your action plan then covers eligible use E, because remember, vacant is only